Today's episode is brought to you by our company, NanoChomp Marketing Strategy and Analytics. We help product and marketing teams solve problems and experience growth using data and approachable AI. Visit nanochomp.com to learn more. Hey everyone, today on SoundBITES we have Ravi Kurani. He's the founder of Sutro, and Ravi has a strong background in entrepreneurship, growth hacking, IoT, AI, machine learning, you name it. He's been using all of those tools in his tool set to build Sutro, which is a platform and product that helps monitor the water in your pools and spas. So it's a really cool IoT device. It makes sure that the chemistry in your pool is in order, and it keeps all your water crystal clear. So Ravi, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, Ravi, let's start way back. Like, what got you on the path you're on now? What's your background? Tell us who you are.
Yeah, I was born in the sunny streets of Southern California. My parents are immigrants from India, and so I'm what is that zero at their first generation American, whatever you want to call it. I grew up, funnily enough, as a pool boy because my dad used to have a chain of pool and spa supply stores. And so I've done everything from, acid washes to installing pumps to skimming the leaves off the top of your pool, all the way to running my own pool store, or well, one of my dad's pool stores in Huntington Beach. And so grew up in a city called Riverside, which is down in the deserts of California. It's not we're about an hour and a half away from the beach. And ended up studying mechanical engineering from the University of California, Riverside. Had a really short stint at NASA, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or NASA Ames, down in LA. And as I kind of went through that, I basically realized I just didn't want to be like an engineer anymore. And so I kind of ended up getting an MBA in Monterey.
Wow, that's awesome. Like, the fact that you don't have too frequently. You don't have people coming saying like, "Oh, I was in casually worked at NASA for a little bit. I was the Jet Propulsion Labs, which is pretty sweet. That's
Yeah.
awesome. So, but your experience there, probably what crash course in both engineering, problem solving, and bureaucracy. I'd have to imagine. And all three of those decided, hey, like I want to get on the business side of the equation, and so you went for an
Yeah,
MBA.
exactly. And that's kind of where I ended up going towards the MBA. And so I did that at Middlebury's campus in Monterey.
Cool.
And as I was kind of in the middle of my MBA program, I ended up actually taking a stint where I worked for a venture capital firm in India.
Okay.
And so I did spend a decent amount of time in India, actually about a year, working with a venture capital firm called Village Capital. And Village Capital basically focuses on the intersection of like profit and purpose. And so we had about a $20 million venture capital fund. And out of the venture capital fund, we basically invested in companies that were focusing on the bottom of the pyramid. So people who earn
Hmm.
less than $2 a day. And if you earn less than $2 a day, you have like a really interesting problem set, right?
Yeah.
We funded technologies that ended up with like solar electrification in villages. We looked at how to give farmers flip phones, basically, so they could like better actually understand what's actually happening in their crops. We gave bee boxes to farmers to basically better help pollinate their crops,
Hmm.
and so kind of everything in between. We ended up managing with this fund.
That's fascinating. So, yeah, like when you think about the problem sets that you're solving, it's a different world. It's not, how can I communicate and send emojis faster? It's how do I keep people fed? How do we survive? Are the problem sets that you're solving at that level, which is pretty fascinating.
Exactly. Yeah.
How fulfilling was that for you? Or how did you feel about, you know, helping people get that, eat more easily and sort of do all of these things? Like, how did that make you feel?
Yeah, I mean, very much so, right? A big purpose of the fund was around poverty alleviation, and so we had about,
Hmm.
I think, $10 or $15 million that we had first deployed into India. We also had a arm in Africa as well, and so it was really fulfilling in the sense that in the U.S. and in Europe, right, we kind of live this like life of abundance. We can turn on the tap and we get water. You can hop in a car and you can get anywhere. Gasoline is freely available. The coordinate system in which we live in is just obviously very different than if you lived on less than $2 a day. And so the kind of business models are different. The way that you help bring people out of poverty is different. The problem sets are different, right? Like we had a big trajectory towards women's empowerment. a lot of women end up staying at home in villages, and they may want to study, but if they don't have light, they can't study at night. And so a lot of the solar electrification that we were doing through, cheap solar lanterns that we were able to give to people in villages really helped us kind of connect those dots. And, one of the kind of externalities are that more women can study, more girls can go to school. They can do things in the evening and still kind of keep the same traditional family set that they otherwise would, without really kind of disrupting that. And so that's kind of one example of what implications our technology or deployments had.
Man, like, yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating when you think about the implications of water, right? You talked on water, just like turning the tap on. We take that for granted, right? And then we'll complain about the chlorine in our water, and that's fine. But the fact is that that's a 1% of the world type solution, really. When you think about places in India, you think about China, you think about places all over sub-Saharan Africa where that is not the reality. Like digging a well, and then the consequences of not having water are illness and illness propagation that comes out of it, aside from the dehydration, which I think,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think you hit a point on the head there, right? The largest killer in the world is actually water, is waterborne illnesses. Diarrhea and dysentery are the two largest killers in the world. And a lot of the way that that's actually transferred is through dirty water or like unclean water, or you not
Mhm.
washing your hands, sanitary issues. And so, yeah, it's really interesting. And I think you did hit the nail on the head of kind of the next part of my life, which was moving into the water world. A lot of the deal flow that we saw was around water filtration. People were building filters to help clean your water, but nobody was really looking at water sensors or what was wrong with the water. And so that's kind of where I first set my eyes on, we can build all the great treatment that we can, but if we don't know what's wrong with it, then how are we actually treating it?
Yeah.
And if you kind of double click into that problem, water is different for each application that you actually use it for, right? In your swimming pool, which we're all familiar with, you need a high chlorine because a high chlorine content kills the bacteria. In drinking water, you probably don't want to drink your pool water, but you probably don't want some of the nutrients that are inside there. Or
Yeah.
the nutrients that you took out of your drinking water are really good for your plants, right? You put nitrates and phosphates in your water, you put fertilizers in waters to make sure that your grapes, your lettuce grow a particular way. And so it kind of really came down to sensing of, if you know what the input water chemistry is and you can sense it, you can then better kind of treat it for the application that you need. And when we started looking at the water sensing market, it either was really, really cheap technology. There were like test strips that basically were prone to human error, or
Mhm.
they were extremely expensive, $10,000, $5,000 devices that obviously somebody under $2 a day would not be able to afford.
Mhm.
And so we first set out to actually build an affordable water sensor that was autonomous, that could tell people what the issues were with their drinking water.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of how we first got our start with Sutro.
And yeah, you think about, you made a lot of points about the application of water dependence on is dependent on what you want in your water, right? Like, and I think people don't realize that, especially if your experience with water is you hit the tap and fluid comes out, and that should be fine. You don't think about, for crops, you might want different nitrogen levels, different sulfur levels, like different things in it are perfectly fine and actually desirable. Whereas if you're consuming it, that's a different story altogether. And you're using your engineering background to basically form a transfer function to say, hey, with this input in this intervention, I can get this output, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. It's an if this then that statement that is that, let's call it a black box, that whatever the inputs are, and depending on whatever the outputs are, there's some delta, and whatever
Yeah.
that delta is a slew of solutions that could be anywhere between adding more chlorine to adding more fertilizer to removing chlorine, based on whatever that end output is. 100%.
So the world kind of came full circle for you. Water was a part of your upbringing effectively, and then you looked at all the different applications, and then Sutro now works really well in pool applications and spa applications, right?
Correct. Yeah. So we initially tried selling the technology to the Indian government, and it just didn't work. It was riddled with red tape. I think I
Sure.
was probably earlier as an entrepreneur there. I really didn't know how to navigate the kind of political scene of what was happening in the local governments and the kind of Indian federal government. And so we ended up coming back to California. I still kind of had the technology in my back pocket, and went back to what I knew, right? My dad used to have a chain of pool and spa supply stores. I was a pool boy. We did a ton of pool tests. If you take a little sample of your pool water and put the chemicals inside there. Um, and so through that, I was like, why don't we just switch this around? Let's market to B2C, to wealthy pool owners, use the dollars from the extra margins that we have, and then basically use that to reinvest in the company. And eventually we'll go towards the drinking water, agriculture, and food and beverage markets later. And so that's kind of how we got our start into the pool industry.
How was that transition of kind of going from like, we want to sell to the Indian government to, okay, we want to go to a B2C product. We want to hit these wealthy pool owners, a very big shift. What was that transition like?
Yeah, I guess I can say it wasn't really linear.
Mm.
I ended up getting a job, and in between actually would be like the truthful story. I worked at a boutique consultant that focused on more efficient building management, right? So we would look at like LEED certifications, if you've heard of those.
Yeah.
We would go into like the large building portfolios, and we would help with like energy, clean air, the water, stuff like that. And I think in the middle of seeing that, I also noticed that there is a big market in like cooling water towers, because
Yeah.
calcification is a big problem over there. And so I kind of like kept coming back to me that this water sensing as a product is definitely a market that's much needed. And so I think the like actual story that got me to flip on the switch was I was running my father's online e-commerce store. And as I was just kind of answering customer comments, I found myself asking about water chemistry a ton. And I'm like, hey, I have this idea for a water chemistry sensor. What if I just like built it and then deployed it? And like this e-commerce platform was linked with the water testing, because we did that at my dad's store. And so like the whole thing kind of came like a full circle. And I'm like, what if I just took my dad's store, built out the e-commerce. We have IoT now. And then I built out the sensor, and I made this full end-to-end kind of ecosystem that did water chemistry management, had the black box, and then did the treatment. And we gave those treatments to the customers. And so that was kind of the like roundabout path that ended up getting me to going from India to swimming pools.
It sounds like, if you were to make a book, that'd be a good title for it.
Yeah, yeah,
Weirdly enough. But what's interesting is like that's kind of the route that, companies like Tesla took too, right? Like they were like, oh, if we try to release a sedan in the market, we're going to get crushed. But if we release a high-end sports car that's high dollar value to high-end clients, we can start there with the technology. We can then work our way into the broader market. And when I think about it, those people that are using it for pools and spas, like Lauren and I talk about a lot, whole house filtration for water. And like we are in pretty clean water in Raleigh and Durham, but it's front of mind for us. And I think like a lot of people that are in millennial generation, like anything that's an endocrine disruptor has been like smashed into our head. If you listen to a
sure.
Huberman podcast, like you can't
Yeah,
not get away from hormonal disruptors. So we think about it a lot just from that standpoint. And we're fortunate enough to not be living on $2 a day most of the time. So we're able to think, okay, I can use whole house filtration. What does that look like? Which creates a market for you, which creates the opportunity to continue to expand, which then gives you the opportunity to address those $2 a day living condition problems more effectively and democratized with the same hardware effectively, right?
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think there is a question to be had about distribution. Like, how do you actually distribute the product? Um, when we get into that sort of whole home water sensing, which is a market that we very much would like to go into,
Yeah.
the question becomes: do you start back on the B2B or B2G arena? Do you go towards government and municipalities? Now that we've built a robust product in the pool and spa market, do you go with cities, and do you monitor city water quality at the city level,
Yeah.
so you can make sure and mandate that tens of thousands of people actually have clean water? Do you have varying distribution points where consumers can then just kind of reverse engineer that information if you deploy a handful of those into homes? And it really just depends on like the amount of capital and the kind of funding model as well as distribution that'll kind of dictate how we actually implement that sort of solution.
Yeah. Do you anticipate? I know the red tape may be different, but what would an attack plan be for getting into those municipalities? And how do you think that would? How do you think you'd be successful there?
Yeah, I think the cool thing now is that anywhere that manual water testing is used, If there is a test strip or a test kit that is actively used in the market, our technology works to basically allow for remote sensing. So one, you can get more data points. Secondly, you remove the kind of human error that's there. And thirdly, you can actually build platforms on top of the sensors, right? Once you get a data stream of information that's otherwise was not available, you can really unlock kind of the latter half of that black box, if this then that triangle, where you can start getting into actually building the solutions, because you need to kind of understand what's wrong with the water to actually figure out how to fix it. And now you can almost build the entire business model of, well, how do we fix it? And then we kind of go back full circle into the companies that we're seeing, which was the water filtration companies, to figure out the best way to build the right filter for the application you're using it for.
Yeah, and that when you think like we are in the data space for a lot of what we do, and when you think about analytics, you have descriptive analytics, like what happened, diagnostic analytics, like why did it happen, predictive analytics, like what's going to happen, and then prescriptive analytics, how can we make it happen? And where y'all are at right now are in that descriptive and diagnostic point. Like this is what's going on with the water. This is what you need to do. But you can get to the point of predicting what'll happen based on events, and then even being the intermediary to automatically make the corrections and fix things, and then you can think about what's the subscription model of reordering, and like it's a really interesting problem you get to solve to make things as autonomous as possible. It's like a clean pool as a service effectively.
Yeah, exactly. And it really boils down to unlocking that data stream from sensors, right? The more
Yeah.
sensors we have, the smarter the system becomes.
What is the It sounds like you have the technical problems solved, and most of the things you're working on as a founder are channel problems, use case problems, growth problems. What does that balance look like, and how do you make your decisions when you're trying to prune that decision tree?
Yeah, it's tough, honestly, because I think the problems are still the same. You only have so much money, you only have so much time, you have only so many people that can work on a particular problem. Um, and so as we do grow bigger, and as we have made the product more robust and it works, and we can deploy it, the problem still, like I said, is the same, right? It's money, people, and time. When we kind of think about that, we initially are focusing on going through channel partners, right? So the kind of goal right now for Sutro is, how do we get more Sutros and more pools? And that's working with the best and biggest and brightest partners in the market. So you can think about like the largest chemical company, the largest pool company, the largest hot tub company. And I kind of envision these as like little Trojan horse fractals, if you may,
Mhm.
right? You kind of have to like validate the sensor. You then build channel distribution partners so that you can get more sensors into more market or into more pools through the channels that you're actually, or through the channel partners you're actually working with. And then the cool thing with that fractal is you actually end up, double clicking that down. You
Mhm.
kind of minimize that, and then you can then use that as a fractal to get to the next market. So you can say, hey, look, we're going to go to agriculture now, which is a 100x or 1000x larger, probably 10,000x larger market than swimming
Sure.
pools. And like look at all of the robust product that we've built in pool, and you can kind of use that to basically jump into the next market. And so that's kind of how I like think about channel strategies and launch. And that's, if you go back to what I said first, the main strategy right now is basically unlocking the best in class in the pool market, so we can then distribute that, build software and hardware for those particular partners, and then unlock market number two.
Got it. That makes sense. And it's like the tough part about entrepreneurship, especially like I'm fascinated with your initial life in India. I want to get back into that a little bit, but you're really trying to deploy limited resources against unlimited possibilities, and you have to make those really difficult decisions along the path, that are extremely consequential, right? Like everyone, when you're in a huge company, if you make a choice, it's probably what if you get it wrong, you might lose 1% of market value, right? Which is big, but it's not crippling. But for y'all, like, getting it right or wrong has huge implications. How do you
Yeah,
take small bets? Like, how do you make like big vision with small bets and keep survivable?
exactly. Yeah, and that kind of is the typical. Yeah, I think you nailed the startup problem on the head, right? How do you take a continuous amount of small bets daily, so that in en mass you're just doing something that's different, better, faster, smarter than your competitors, and your worldview is obviously different than everybody else that's out there, because that's why you're a startup. Um, and so how do you just continuously do that to then actually realize this larger vision 100%?
I guess I'm thinking, how do you stay motivated and excited about what you're doing? I'm sure there are a lot of like really high days and then low days. How do you sort of survive those lower days to to stay focused and stay motivated?
Yeah, it's kind of, all across the board. So I sold the company back in 2019. And so I'm kind of, we're nested inside of a much larger company in Canada. They're actually, they're a chemicals company. And that's their primary role. Um, to kind of answer your questions about the high days and the low days, right? Our kind of problems are a little bit different than like your typical startup because we're not having to go out and like raise venture. We're answering obviously to a board and to the management that's at this chemical company, which has its own set of problems, right? They have a particular worldview of the way that they see the market in Canada. They don't have any sort of fingers in the U.S., but then we get folks that make decisions on behalf of the way that we actually implement strategy in the U.S.
Hmm.
And so it's your like typical acquisition problem, right? You have a larger company that obviously purchased the smaller company because they don't have a core competency in it. But at the same rate, if you don't give enough independence to the team to kind of move in a particular direction, you at the same rate also do get handicapped, but from a different reason. It's not due to cash, but it's due to potentially vision or it's due to direction. And so I guess to kind of return to your question of how do I manage the low days and how do you manage the high days? I think you just kind of have to realize that every day is just a day at the end of the day, right? It's like you just continue on because you know tomorrow will exist. And if you're feeling low today, just realize that if you live in the present moment, it's going to change the next moment that you have, and whatever is happening is fleeting, and the
Yeah.
world changes right in front of you. So, yeah.
Yeah, but speaking of things being fleeting, like some of the big concepts, like things that are wabi sabi, things that are like what ichikai, ichigo, or I think I'm going to
Mhm.
butcher that, but effectively it means that like the most important and valuable things in life are imperfect and impermanent, right? And it's like
Very true.
trying to really embrace those is a different philosophy from like how I was raised.
Yeah, entirely.
So when you've taken companies from super small, from concepts to basically your parents' e-commerce store for the pool store, brought it up, sold it to a bigger company. You're part of a bigger organization now. You've got different concerns and constraints. What does that transition look like for you and for your team? How do you navigate that successfully and still keep your culture?
Yeah, I think it's first and foremost learning how to grow with the organization, right? Back to kind of the like Japanese philosophy or being in the present. The company itself is also an organism, right? And so what we were yesterday is very different than what we are now, than what we're going to be tomorrow. And kind of instituting that sort of thinking into the team as well, I think really helps one allow the team and the company to kind of grow around what needs to be built. But secondarily, also allows us and flexibility into maintaining and managing expectations so that we're not like, oh hey, this is who we used to be and now we're not that anymore, right? I think that that sort of delta and that sort of push and pull ends up hurting companies. It hurts people, it hurts kind of egos. And so we just kind of try to stay ahead of that as we move forward. um, a very tactical thing, kind of to the entrepreneurs out there is building systems and building SOPs. Like every time we realize that something can be delegated, we have this concept that I kind of coined a few months ago called task bridging. And it's basically the democratization of something or a task, so that there's not one person or there's not a quote unquote skilled person that has to be focused on working on it. And when I say skilled person, it can mean like a developer or a customer service agent, right? If something is locked in a particular silo, um, basically task bridging unsilos it, right? It allows the task to be touched by more hands, so that you basically get more coverage on something as it goes. And a good example of that was prior to us building this tool called Demonto, the data monitoring tool. We used to have engineers that would have to go in and basically like touch every single device that we had, right? If there's like a problem with the actual IoT device. This tool democratized customer support to be able to touch and turn knobs and turn levels on the devices, so that they can in real time when they're with the customer actually like activate or turn off the device or turn it on, do whatever they need to do with it, versus having to get a 24-hour SLA with having an engineer do it. And so I would liken something like that to be task building processes, building SOPs around getting more hands on a task so that you can have more coverage.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I was going to say, what is that? How do you institute something like that? You said you coined it a few months ago. Is that something you were doing maybe more informally and then you coined it and now there's like a formal process for doing something like that? How does that work?
Yeah, we have been doing it for actually a long time. For the last
Mm,
3 or 4 years, ever since we got acquired, we've kind of had this philosophy in the company. The way that we implement it is by first identifying that something is siloed, and then prioritizing whether or not that silo needs to be unlocked or not. Right? Sometimes a silo
Mhm.
doesn't need to be unlocked, and it's fine where it is. Maybe that's by design, right? Maybe having a silo is by design because the QA team needs to run through everything, and if we have everybody QAing, it would be problematic. But then again, maybe you have a dog food program. So everybody actually gets familiar with the QA process, but in their own way, so that the CS team maybe gets more comfortable with the product, right? So there's kind of varying spectrum of how that would work, just given the kind of brainstorm I just really quickly went through. Um, and the reason I say that we just coined it is because I actually co-authored a book called Story Driven Smart Products off of the journey of what we've built at Sutro. And Jari, my co-author, and I were trying to think of like how do we actually describe this process, and it we ended up coining it as task bridging. So I guess that's why I say we just coined it.
I love the architectures. Like anything that's memorable, like we could probably sample that from you because we basically have the less elegant, we call it dog with a note solutions or workflows. Like anytime we can take a dog with a note solution, we try to build that together so we can enable people to pick up where somebody else left off, or make those tasks more functional. And then to the point of where you kind of started that conversation, if something is repeatable and it's definable, it's probably automatable, so you can work your way towards that too, which is interesting.
Exactly.
So you're
What was I was going to say, or how was the process of writing a book? What was that like and what made you want to do that?
Yeah, I've been writing ever since COVID. I think
Mm,
I like used to not be the best writer, honestly, and I think I once I started meditating, I kind of realized I like needed an outlet to be able to
mm,
just not an outlet in terms of sharing, but just an outlet in terms of like processing information.
yeah.
And I, had a notebook and like writing obviously in it was really helpful. I ended up reading this book called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. It's a really really good book if you're like stuck or you kind of feel like you have ideas but don't know how to kind of get them out. And Julia has this concept that she calls morning pages. And there's varying, you know, worlds of morning pages, but her kind of worldview of it is basically 3 pages end to end every single morning.
Mm,
Even if you write like I don't have any thoughts, I don't know what to write, just write that for 3 pages is the execution of morning pages. And so just doing that kind of really got me into writing. And then I was chatting with my buddy Jari, who had actually written a few other books, and he has this series called Story Driven, right? So like how stories define selling products. He has like story driven B2B, story driven sales. And I was like, hey, we should make a story driven smart products. Like we did this with Sutro, and he was like, that's a great idea. And so I kind of
mm.
you know took the easy way out on this first book and basically piggybacked off of his series, but we ended up co-authoring it. And so yeah, that was kind of the process of how I got into it.
That's really interesting. What was there something like we talk about this a lot with like things being Instagram versus reality. It's like something you thought it was going to be versus what it actually was. What was that like? Did
I
you have
think
a different view going into it?
Yeah, you know what? Writing with Jari was really painless. I mean, we used to work together at Sutro, and
Mm,
so he ran kind of PR, marketing, and strategy for us. So like we're very familiar in kind of talking about stories. And the nice part about it was it was a little cathartic actually, just to like go back to the good old days with Jari, and we were able to kind of trace back the plans and the strategies that we'd initially written, kind of how we ended up implementing it, which was really cool to actually see that the strategies that we had made are actively being implemented and are being picked up by the market, and the stories that we told to kind of inject that into the market, to like tell that narrative. um, and so I guess Instagram and reality was like very very, very similar for me. It was kind of
Oh, okay.
one of the same. I was taking truly a picture with no filter on my life.
That's actually really
Yeah.
rare. That's and especially during like, and it sounds like your approach to building your business didn't have a lot of Instagram versus reality either, because as your consulting world and what you had seen a completely different view from what a lot of entrepreneurs think entrepreneurship is, right? And we run into this a lot, like especially like again on Instagram, what people think entrepreneurship is, and like private jets and Louis Vuitton bags. That's not most of it. That's not even a little bit of it, really. It's like most of it is, can we pay our people this month? Are we going to be able to get the solution through? Are we going to be able to get this funding? And I think like you probably had a sober view of that because your parents owned a business, and then you had seen all kinds of different businesses from all over the place, not just worked as an Accenture consultant, dropped into a Fortune 500 company and solving big high level problems. You were solving some gritty problems. Um, what type of problems do you like solving the most when you're looking at, like, if I could just take something apart, what problem is that?
I think it sits on a spectrum. I really like solving easy problems, right? Things that like you can use Zapier to like stitch together, a handful of things,
Yeah.
or whatever that might be. And then on the flip side of me, I do like solving really, really meaty problems, which is kind of why I got into this water world, right? There's a lot of interesting like climate related issues that are out there. There's just stuff like upstream in terms of like materials manufacturing, um, all the way to like energy, right? I feel like in society, if we can build a more abundant society, we just need energy. It's all kind of back to like how do we generate more power?
Mhm.
Every time we've had kind of a revolution, all the way from like fire to gasoline to combustion to like nuclear, right? I think if we can have a step function of energy, then that'll be really interesting. And so like sometimes the like really, really meaty problems like those are interesting.
Yeah.
And the other times I'm like, I just want to write a really small dinky API to like pull some information and then like analyze it and graph it.
Yeah, I guess we all have days like that, right? Where it's like we're down to solve a big problem, and then some days it's just can't even fathom it. Just let me get into an Excel spreadsheet and put some headphones on. Totally
Yeah,
understand
yeah,
that.
exactly.
Well, what does the future look like for you, and what gets you excited about it?
The future looks like a more abundant future. I
Mm,
feel like we need to be more abundant but more efficient at doing it. And I think I saw that with my work in India, right? Everybody wants
mm,
to boil up to the middle class. Everybody wants a TV. We all want cars. We all want running tap water. Um, and there's probably a million more things past that that we haven't even touched yet, right? I think sci-fi novels give us a glimpse of what some authors think the future looks like, but whatever direction that goes into, whether it's flying cars all the way to like hovercrafts, it kind of boils down to like abundance of making sure that we're kind of leveling up. And if we as a kind of global population want to level up, we have to just make sure that we have the right building blocks in place and we're able to do it sustainably. And I don't think sustainably like fits that sustainability definition. That's not what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. I'm just saying like, can we do it efficiently where we don't, kill ourselves in the process? Basically, is like my definition of that. Um, I don't know what technologies do that right now. My fingers are on energy. My fingers are on like clean water. It's on clean air. It's on making sure that we use land and we can write policy efficiently. After moving to New York, I've just really gotten tied into like DC a lot more, and into just bigger money, which is very different than San Francisco.
Mhm.
Um, I know it's a kind of roundabout way to answer the question, but I guess I don't really know. However, I just want to solve the abundance problem and the sustainability problem.
Yeah, and I think like the word sustainability ends up with uh, a stigma on it, right? People think like they use it as part of like the greenwashing of a lot of things, and that's fine, that's
Sure.
great. But when you're talking about like what can we do in perpetuity, like what is actually able to do, and we think about like as far as we know, Earth has a limited number of resources, and we're utilizing them at an increasing rate.
Yeah.
And well, we have 8 billion people here right now. When you think about it, I would say back of the napkin, I pull up the stats, but like half of them don't have consistent clean drinking water. Probably half of them don't have electricity. And when you think about even electricity, we do this thought exercise from time to time. And it's like, how far do you have to go back in time to blow someone's mind? And you think about like what device you'd bring. But then you go the other way and you think about like in one person's lifetime, what did they experience? And in the early, like people that were alive today in the United States grew up in a time basically pre-electricity, pre-television, pre not dirt floors.
Hmm.
Like, and it's weird to think about, but 1920s, like electricity in households didn't exist until really like the 40s.
Yeah.
That was widespread. And you don't think about people that saw the first flight at Kitty Hawk would have also seen the moon landing. That's one person's
Yes.
lifetime.
Yeah. It's crazy.
And like as we continue in this acceleration, like with AI and with energy consumption, it's like, how do you solve that problem? How do you solve the energy consumption problem? And the regulations that are there to protect a lot of people end up holding a lot of people behind, like leaving a
Mhm.
lot of people behind. Nuclear, I think, is interesting. That's an interesting debate because it's almost emissionless, other than the fact that you're using uranium to do it, and when things go wrong, they go violently wrong. You know,
Yeah, and I think it depends on the I'm no nuclear scientist, nor have I studied
yeah,
nuclear policy, but I think there is a spectrum on how those things should be built, could be built. Like I think there's a way to build smarter regulation, to build smarter product. I feel like we're way smarter now than we
Mm,
were in 1950.
yeah,
yeah.
We have technology, we have sensors, we have IoT. Like, is there a way to like reimagine? If you really had to go to a tabula rasa, like with no regulation, like start from like first principles again.
Hmm.
yeah,
How would we design the infrastructure and the ecosystem such that we could then solve that problem?
yeah,
Yeah.
And I think like you're right, nuclear, is dangerous, but given the framework that we had from the last 70 years ago, like, is there a way of redefining
Right.
that? And so I would just kind of re-ask a lot of those questions.
sure. Like France is doing an amazing job, right? I think like France has solved making smaller systems
Hmm.
more scalable and sustainable, so you can copy and paste them with less failure modes to at a macro level. But yeah,
Yeah.
like it's a fascinating problem to solve. What happens is the world population, like gosh, in our lifetime, effectively the world's population has doubled,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
is so. What happens when it doubles again? Like in our lifetime again, before we're at retirement age, we could see 10 billion, 12 billion people on this earth. How do you feed them? How
Sure.
do you provide the electricity? And how do you keep the resources available to keep everybody elevated? It's a fascinating problem to solve. And I think it starts with water, like what you're
Yeah,
working on.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's people are not going to need less water, that's for sure. So the future of your business, you're focusing on getting into new channels and continuing to expand on water alone, or are you going to use the same technology to solve some of these other problems tangentially on that platform?
We want to use the same technology to scale horizontally into the other water markets. That's the plan. It really depends on kind of what happens with the acquisition. Kind of there's a million variables that are in front of us, and so my kind of marching orders are still that I hope to solve the problem of abundance, whether it's with Sutro or not. Again, we can move in a million different directions. The question is
Sure.
kind of how do we like ask the right questions and solve them. Um, Going back to the very first question that I asked, right? We're solving water filtering, but how do we solve water sensing? And so I think it just like
Hmm.
that root thought loop is the same. And how do we ask that in different ways for different things?
Really fascinating. So, toward this part of the podcast, we like to wrap on basically the same question every time. So, like, Lauren, do you want to grab this for the
Yeah.
table one?
The question we like to ask is if you could have dinner with either the 18-year-old version of yourself or the 25-year-old version of yourself, what advice would you give them? What would you tell them, sort of knowing what you know now?
I would tell them to drop their ego, first of all.
Mm.
Nobody really cares about you. People care about themselves. Um, you're trying to impress way too many people around you. Just focus
Mm.
on the things that matter and kind of move forward in that case. And with that, there's actually a bit of humor to life, right? Like it's
Mm.
if we think so heavily of ourselves and other people, then you end up in this very like kind of stoic or serious mindset. Um, but like we talked about earlier, life is life is passing, like it is happening, and so just take joy in a lot of things that you do. Don't overthink it. Don't be over too serious. That would kind of be like my vision to my 18 or 25-year-old.
I love that. I love that. We've never gotten the same answer twice, so it's very fun for that streak not to be broken. What gosh, was there like a moment in your life where you were like where you saw that transition, maybe where you took things too seriously and then you realized that by letting go you were able to maybe enjoy things and maybe open up a new way of thinking that you hadn't before? Is there something that you remember from that?
Yeah, I think it was after I had sold the company.
Hmm.
Um, which, some would be like, oh, haha, like hindsight 2020. Of course you sold your company and you like got the thing done. And then you like look back and you're like, well, don't care about it. Um, it's, I think just the more people that I've been talking to lately, and just also like more of the founders that have or have not sold their companies, um, have kind of resonated a very similar behavior.
Hmm.
And even like some of the very successful people that I've been around that are like 100 times, bigger that in their acquisitions and stuff. After they get kind of a lot of this money, they're still unhappy. And so it's kind of like, well,
Hmm.
then why did you like what's the use of it all?
Yeah.
Mhm.
What's the point?
What's the point? And so then it kind of goes back to that recursive question of if you just are joyful and drop your ego in the moment that you're currently in, then you will just live 9 times out of 10 a much happier life than somebody that just has a ton of money. And like maybe I'm not saying everybody that has money is going to be sad, um, but you can just kind of be happy in that present moment. And I think that when I sold the company, there was just like this big release. It kind of brought that to mind. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think on a theme similar to that, I'll quote Fight Club. It's like, this is your life and it's ending one moment at a time, right?
Totally.
And it's like,
Hmm.
you think about it, it's like time. You can get into the philosophical quantum version of time, but effectively, our experience of it is it's moving forward at a constant velocity as far as we're experiencing it, and you don't know when that endpoint is, but it's coming. So
Hmm.
it's like you get to make a decision every day and make a vote with what you want to do, how you want to live that, and how you want to approach your relationships, your friendships, and your level of joy. And like you can, to some extent, control the cortisol level coursing through your
Yeah.
veins at any given time. But
There's a really interesting. I was with a Zen monk. I
Hmm.
don't know if he was a monk or not, but he may have not been like at monk level. Anyways, I was with a Zen person, and I was like going through this issue and kind of frustrated through it. And he's like, there's kind of four forms of consciousness. Either you can realize that they're doing it to you and you blame them,
Hmm.
or you're doing it to yourself. Like they're just existing, and whatever that thing that they're doing to you, you in your own mind are allowing yourself to be affected by it. It's being done through you, right? Like this is you're part of like something that's happening, or it's just being done, and you're like one of many actors in this like thing that's happening, and you're just so happen to be like living within it. And so he's like, if you can kind of like translate up into that, like I just exist as an actor in this universe where things are happening, you just start to realize that you are in the present moment. Like the person that's doing something to you may have had a bad day. Like the place that you're in just might be too hot and he's like frustrated, or like what, like
Hmm.
whatever the reasons are, you just don't know. And if you always are like, hey, you're yelling at me because you're a bad person, or like it's my reason that I'm thinking that you're doing this to me, or I just live within this environment and I'm like here right now and you're just yelling at me. Okay, well, let's think about why you're yelling at me. Like, why am I angry? What's going on? You end up in a very grounded state, and you can kind of almost zoom out a little bit and say, like, what's happening here? Let's just like do the best that we can do given the situation that we're in. And so that kind of I still like think about that today. That was like a few months ago, and it was really interesting to hear him say that.
yeah, it's an interesting perspective, and I love those conversations that like are those little nuggets that stick with you. And then when you're approached with a situation later, you regurgitate them in a similar tone. There's a guy that Lauren and I used to work with. His name's Ken Donahue, and he used to say, we have a tendency to judge other people based on their worst results,
Hmm.
while also judging ourselves and our performance based on our best intentions.
Sure.
And like that resonated with me a lot because like I've effectively got sent to asshole rehab when I was in corporate America for like being extremely harsh on people and what they would say, what they would do, like
Yeah.
really harsh to an extreme, probably negatively impacted a lot of people more than I even realized. And then when I think about it, it's like, yeah, I was judging them based on results they were getting, not knowing the puzzle pieces that they contained to make those decisions.
For
While on
sure.
the other end, if I got a shitty result, it was like, well, this is why. Like I always had a good, I had a good excuse for why I got a bad result, but I didn't give anyone else that grace. But I think
Entirely.
about those moments a lot,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, okay, so I guess the very last question would be, what, besides the books that you've authored and your co-author has created, what books are you into or interested in right now? What podcasts are in your ears? What kind of media are you consuming, or that you've suggested to other people?
I really love Radiolab by WNYC. That's on one of my like Spotify subscribe, notify me when a new episode drops. I just love their like narration style, love how they like storytell, and I love their topics. They're always kind of like a little bit off the beaten path, but kind of make you at the end of the podcast be like, huh, interesting.
Hmm.
The books that I've been reading lately is actually sci-fi. I feel like sci-fi authors as of late in this in this kind of mode that I'm in right now, give a really interesting outlook on what the future looks like. And there's a whole spectrum of sci-fi authors where the future's bleak or the future's really nice.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Ones that I really liked in the last year was Clara and the Sun. It's about kind of like an android robot that's like a friend, and like families can buy them, but I won't spoil the story, but that's kind of like the premise of it. I went back to the basics and I looked at the Hugo Awards, which was like the sci-fi
Oh yeah.
awards. And I looked at Isaac Asimov, I, Robot, in
Yeah.
like the 1920s. Um, and the last one is I just finished up the Three Body Problem.
Oh, okay.
It's the Netflix show that's there with by the Chinese author Liu Xixin. Really really good book.
You mentioned Isaac Asimov, and some of those science fiction novels that were created that were unbelievable were created in like the 1900s and 1800s even. And
Yeah,
it's amazing to even think, like, back to the conversation we were having, this is in a time where houses did not have electricity. The car effectively did not exist for most of the population, and they're dreaming of this world. And there's one book, it was written in, think, like, it was 1880, 1884. It's called Flatland. And it's not flat earth, but it's what's interesting about it is like the inhabitants of Flatland live in a two-dimensional plane.
hmm,
And I think this has been like occupying a lot of my brain space forever for a lot of different reasons. But they live in a two-dimensional plane and they can only see things in two dimensions. So like everything looks like a line to them of different
sure,
distance. So like if somebody's
yep,
a square, or somebody's a triangle, or somebody's a circle, they look like a line with just different shadowing across them because they can't see the
yeah,
top. So the punchline is something from three-dimensional space, a sphere, is presenting himself to the members of Flatland to show, oh, there's a third dimension that you're not even aware of. I'm a sphere. And
yeah,
when it comes down to Flatland, like, you're a mechanical engineer, you can already see the problem. Everyone at Flatland will see a dot and then a line and then a longer line and a longer
yeah,
line, then a shorter line, then a dot, and then it's gone.
sure,
Right. So all you can see at any time is the two-dimensional cross section of it. So I think about us, like, or I think about blind spots that you have. You can only see like three dimensions plus time. That's all you got here. So like, what does a four-dimensional thing look like? What happens when you only have a cross section of the information and you're making decisions on it? Like, what does
yeah,
that look like? And if
for
you
sure,
haven't thought about the problem from a different dimension or a different angle, no matter how much someone tries to explain something to you, you might be seeing this two-dimensional cross section of what they're telling you through
yep,
your lens. So I've been thinking about that a lot. But that book was written in
totally,
the 1800s, and they're thinking
yeah,
about multidimensionality. Like, what does a three-dimensional object crossing through 2D space look like? And then it goes up another level. Like, what is a 4D object coming through the sphere 3D space? It's the same
mm,
problem, right?
for
Like,
sure,
the
yeah,
sphere can't visualize a 4D object. And so I'm like, man, it's fascinating. And again, it's like silly because it's talking about shapes and lines and stuff, but it's a really interesting book if you're into that kind of stuff. And it's
yeah.
yeah,
I'll definitely check it
1800s.
out. Flatlanders,
They're just flat land.
Flatland. Okay,
Yeah. I don't even know who wrote it. I probably should know that, but it's yeah, it's been almost everything I'm doing. I'm thinking about, like, what dimension am I missing in this part of the
yeah,
conversation now?
for sure,
But
for sure.
Robbie, it's been really great talking to you, man. Like, it's been great hearing about your business. It's great hearing about your story and your growth, how you started from pools, made your way to a consulting company working with big problems in India. Well, big problems at small dollar values, which is fascinating. And then how it came back full circle to water clarification, water sensing, and solving some huge problems that are only going to get bigger over time. So it's really fascinating. We really appreciate you joining us today, and thank you so much.
And
Yeah,
where can people find you, Ravi? Where can people
uh,
look you up?
yeah. People can find me on LinkedIn under Ravi Kurani, or actually, if you wanted to go to ravikurani.com, I have everything linked over there.
And the name of the book again?
Is story-driven smart products.
Story Driven Smart Products. Awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for
Thanks,
having me.
Ravi.